My son banned me from his wedding, can you believe that? But just days later, he sent me a bill for $90,000, expecting me to pay for his fairy tale celebration and honeymoon. I was shocked, heartbroken, and furious. What I did next changed. Everything. I still remember the morning like it was yesterday. The sun poured in through my kitchen window, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air. I had been counting down the days, believing any moment now my son would call me with the wedding details. As his father, I thought I'd be there standing, proudly by his side, watching him step into this new chapter of life. That was my dream until the phone rang, and everything changed. It wasn't my son's voice on the other end, but a distant cousin's. He spoke casually, as if delivering ordinary news, telling me the invitations had gone out and the date was set. My heart skipped a beat. Invitations? Date? I hadn't received anything. My smile froze as he asked what suit I would wear, assuming I already knew. I chuckled nervously, brushing off the conversation, but inside, something heavy sank in my chest. Could it be possible that my own son had forgotten me? The truth hit me later that evening, when I finally gathered the courage to call my son directly. He answered coldly, his tone sharp and impatient. "Dad," he said, "I didn't want to bring this up, but I don't think it's a good idea for you to come. It's not personal. It's just better this way." His words sliced through me like glass. Not personal? How could being banned from my own son's wedding not be personal? I sat there in silence, the phone pressed against my ear, the room spinning around me. My hands trembled as I tried to process his words. For years, I had dreamed of this day, saving small amounts, imagining the moment I'd shake his hand as a married man. But instead, I was left with nothing but emptiness, an aching silence, and the sharp realization that the bond I thought we shared had cracked. That was the day everything changed. The days that followed were the hardest I had ever lived through. My house, once filled with laughter from when my son was younger, now echoed with silence. Every corner reminded me of him, his childhood drawings still framed on the wall, his old trophies collecting dust on the shelf. I sat at the dining table, most evenings staring at the empty chair across from me, wondering how a bond so strong could unravel so quickly. I kept waiting for him to call, to say he had made a mistake, that he wanted me there after all. But the phone never rang. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was deafening, like a punishment for reasons I couldn't understand. I asked myself again and again, had I failed him as a father? Had I done something so unforgivable that he no longer wanted me at the most important day of his life? Each day I tried to keep myself busy. I mowed the lawn, cleaned the garage, even sorted through old photo albums. But instead of distracting me, these tasks only deepened the ache. Seeing his baby pictures, his first steps, his first school play brought tears to my eyes. How could the little boy who once clung to my hand at the park now shut me out of his future completely? The silence from him was more than rejection. It was erasure, as though he wanted to rewrite his life without me in it. And though I tried to push away the pain, one thought haunted me every night as I lay awake in bed. If he didn't want me there for his wedding, what role was left for me at all? As the weeks rolled by, talk of the wedding grew louder among distant relatives and neighbors. I overheard bits and pieces discussions about the venue, the caterers, the flowers. Everyone seemed to know something about the big day. Everyone. But me. There was no envelope in my mailbox, no phone call, no message, just silence. The absence of an invitation wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate, and the sting of that realization left me hollow inside. One afternoon, while watering the garden, Mrs. Langley, my neighbor of 20 years, walked over with a cheerful smile. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "Your son's wedding is going to be the event of the season. Are you excited?" I froze, gripping the watering can tighter. My throat went dry as I forced a smile and mumbled something vague. Deep inside, humiliation burned. I couldn't admit that I hadn't even been invited to my own son's wedding. The whispers spread faster than I could keep up with. People assumed I was simply being private about the details, but the truth gnawed at me. I wanted to shout it out loud that I had been cast aside, as if my presence would stain the celebration. But instead, I stayed quiet, carrying my shame. In silence, that night I sat by the window, the glow of the streetlight casting shadows across the room. I thought of the countless sacrifices I had made for him, working overtime shifts, skipping vacations, going without so he never had to. And now, the same son I had raised with every ounce of my being had erased me from his happiest day. It wasn't just a missing invitation. It was a message written in invisible ink. "You don't belong in my life anymore." Asterisk. As the weeks rolled by, talk of the wedding grew louder among distant relatives and neighbors. I overheard bits and pieces discussions about the venue, the caterers, the flowers. Everyone seemed to know something about the big day. Everyone but me. There was no envelope in my mailbox, no phone call, no message, just silence. The absence of an invitation wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate, and the sting of that realization left me hollow inside. One afternoon, while watering the garden, Mrs. Langley, my neighbor of 20 years, walked over with a cheerful smile. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "Your son's wedding is going to be the event of the season. Are you excited?" I froze, gripping the watering can tighter. My throat went dry as I forced a smile and mumbled something vague. Deep inside, humiliation burned. I couldn't admit that I hadn't even been invited to my own son's wedding. The whispers spread faster than I could keep up with. People assumed I was simply being private about the details, but the truth gnawed at me. I wanted to shout it out loud that I had been cast aside, as if my presence would stain the celebration. But instead, I stayed quiet, carrying my shame in silence. That night, I sat by the window, the glow of the streetlight casting shadows across the room. I thought of the countless sacrifices I had made for him, working overtime shifts, skipping vacations, going without so he never had to. And now, the same son I had raised with every ounce of my being had erased me from his happiest day. It wasn't just a missing invitation. It was a message written in invisible ink. "You don't belong in my life anymore." Asterisk. A week after the wedding, life seemed to crawl back into its dull rhythm. I buried myself in routine, convincing myself that moving forward was the only way to dull the pain. But then, one morning, I heard the mail slot creak open. A thick envelope dropped onto the floor with a heavy thud, unlike the usual stack of bills and flyers. My heart skipped as I bent down to pick it up. The return address bore my son's name. For a fleeting moment, hope surged inside me. Could this be an apology? A gesture of reconciliation? With trembling hands, I tore it open, only to find several neatly printed pages inside. At first glance, it looked official, almost like a business contract. My eyes skimmed the bold heading: wedding expenses and honeymoon contribution. Confusion turned to disbelief as I read line by line. There it was, clear as daylight, a detailed invoice totaling $90,000. Venue rental, catering, photography, designer dress, luxury honeymoon to Europe. It was all there, meticulously itemized. And at the bottom, in my son's handwriting, a chilling note. "Dad, since you couldn't be there, the least you can do is cover the costs." I felt the air leave my lungs. My own son, the boy I had once cradled in my arms, was treating me like a wallet, nothing more. My hands shook as I set the papers on the table. Anger warred with heartbreak. I had missed his wedding, not by my choice, but by his command, and now he had the audacity to bill me for the celebration I had been banned from. It wasn't just about money. It was a declaration. In his new life, I was disposable. I sat at the kitchen table, the invoice spread before me like some cruel joke. My eyes traced the numbers again and again, as if rereading them would somehow make them less real. $90,000. Not a gift, not a suggestion, an expectation. My son had reduced me to a walking checkbook. A sting of exclusion from his wedding was still raw, but this was a wound much deeper. At first, anger surged like wildfire. How dare he? I had sacrificed everything for that boy. Long nights, endless overtime shifts, sleepless worries about bills and school fees. I had given up dreams of my own so that he could chase his. And now, instead of gratitude, he sent me a bill, as though all the years of love, effort, and sacrifice weren't payment enough. But as the minutes ticked by, the anger gave way to something else, a hollow ache. Where had I gone wrong as a father? Had I spoiled him too much? Had I been too forgiving, too eager to shield him from the realities of life? Every memory, from his first steps to his graduation day, came rushing back. I remembered the little boy who used to run into my arms shouting, "Daddy, you're the best." Where had that boy gone? The silence of the house pressed down on me. I realized that this wasn't just about a bill. It was a symbol of the distance that had grown between us, a canyon so wide I wasn't sure it could ever be crossed. And yet, beneath the heartbreak, a new resolve began to stir. If my son thought I would simply fold under this insult, he was gravely mistaken. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something neither of us expected. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing between fury and sorrow. The bill sat on my nightstand like an unwanted guest, a constant reminder of how little I seemed to matter to my own son. But the longer I stared at it, the more my feelings shifted. I realized I had a choice: either let this demand crush me, or turn it into a lesson he would never forget. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat at the kitchen table, pen and notepad in hand. For once, I wasn't thinking as the father who had always rescued his son, but as a man who had been pushed too far. I thought of all the times I had bailed him out, paying off his debts, covering his rent, even fixing his car when he'd neglected it. And now, he thought he could send me a $90,000 invoice for a wedding I wasn't even welcome at? No, that was the final straw. A strange calm settled over me as the plan formed in my mind. If he saw me as nothing more than a wallet, then maybe. It was time he learned what life without that wallet looked like. I wasn't going to scream, beg, or argue. Instead, I was going to answer his bill in the only language he seemed to understand: money, or rather, the absence of it. I folded the invoice neatly and slid it back into its envelope. Then I wrote a short message of my own, just a few words that would change everything. It wasn't cruel, but it carried the weight of decades of sacrifice. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just reacting. I was in control. This time, my son would learn that even a father's patience has limits. I sat at the dining table long after the sun had set. The bill spread out before me like an accusation. My hands shook, not from age, but from the sheer disbelief that my son had reduced me to nothing more than a bank account. Every line of that invoice screamed entitlement, and every dollar sign felt like a slap across the face. I thought back to all the years I had sacrificed. When he needed help with college tuition, I was there. When he lost his first job, I supported him. Even when he made reckless choices, I picked up the pieces. And yet here I was, excluded from his wedding, but still expected to fund his dream day. The hypocrisy burned through me like fire, but as the night wore on, anger gave way to clarity. This wasn't just about the wedding. This was about boundaries I had never drawn, and a respect I had never demanded. If I paid this bill, I would be telling him that it was acceptable to treat me this way. And I couldn't allow that anymore, so I made a decision. Instead of responding with rage or begging for inclusion, I would let my actions speak. One drafted. A simple reply, short, firm, and unforgettable. I slipped the invoice back into its envelope and placed my note on top. My son thought he could shame me into compliance, but what he would receive instead was a lesson in accountability. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. I wasn't just reacting to his selfishness. I was reclaiming my dignity. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about self-respect. And my son was about to learn that even a father's patience has its breaking point. Asterisk, the next morning, I slipped the envelope into the outgoing mail with a calmness I hadn't felt in days. The weight of the paper felt heavier than it should, as though all my years of silence, sacrifices, and disappointments had been folded neatly inside. As the postman carried it away, I whispered to myself, "Let's see how you respond to this, son." A few days later, my phone lit up with his name. I let it ring, then again, and again. Each time I ignored it, sipping my coffee with a steady hand. It wasn't about avoidance. It was about control. For once, I wasn't rushing to soothe his anger or excuse his behavior. I was forcing him to sit with the truth of my decision. Inside that envelope, along with the untouched bill, was my handwritten note. If I am not welcome at your wedding as a father, then my money is not welcome either. Respect is not for sale. It was a single sentence, but I knew it carried the weight of decades. Later that evening, my daughter-in-law's number appeared on the screen. I didn't answer her either. I imagined her face when she saw my words, pale and flushed with disbelief. She had underestimated me, thinking I would always bend, always give, always provide. But this time, the cycle was broken. For the first time, the silence felt powerful. It wasn't the silence of defeat or neglect. It was the silence of a man who had finally chosen his dignity over approval. And as the night deepened, I realized something extraordinary. By refusing to pay that bill, I hadn't lost my son. I had finally found myself. Asterisk, I stood at the mailbox that morning longer than necessary, holding the thick white envelope between my fingers. Inside was not just a bill, but the truth of my feelings, my rejection of their audacity, and my refusal to be used. My pulse slowed as I let it slide into the box, the metallic flap snapping shut with a finality that almost echoed. For the first time in years, I felt free. 3 days later, my phone began to buzz. My son's name lit up the screen, the bold letters pulling at something deep in my chest. Normally, I would have answered in an instant, desperate to keep a fragile connection alive. But this time, I let it ring. Once, twice, a dozen times. My coffee cup warmed my hands as the calls piled up, and I sat still, steady, calm. What he didn't know yet was that I hadn't just returned the bill untouched. I had tucked inside a single piece of paper, written in my own careful script. If you don't want me at your wedding as your father, then you will not want my money either. Respect cannot be bought. That note was short, barely a sentence, but I knew it cut sharper than any check I could ever write. It was the kind of truth people spend a lifetime avoiding, yet it demanded to be read, loud and clear. Later that evening, her number flashed across my screen. My daughter-in-law, the one who thought she had orchestrated the perfect triumph. I pictured her opening the envelope, her smug confidence cracking as her eyes traced my words. She expected me to bend. Instead, I had stood tall. And in that silence, in that choice, I realized I had reclaimed something priceless, my dignity. Asterisk, the pounding at my front door came just after sundown, heavy and urgent, rattling the frame as if they wanted to break it down. I set my cup of tea aside, already knowing who it was before I looked through the peephole. My son stood there, his face tight with anger, and beside him, his wife's arms were crossed like she was preparing for battle. I opened the door slowly, refusing to show the slightest hint of fear. "Dad," my son snapped, his voice raised. "What the hell is this?" He shoved the envelope into my chest. His wife's eyes blazed, feeding off his fury. "You embarrassed us," she hissed. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" I didn't flinch. Instead, I stepped aside and motioned for them to come in. The air inside grew thick with tension as they entered, their anger filling the room like a storm cloud. My son paced back and forth, running a hand through his hair. "All we asked," he said, his voice shaking with frustration, "was for your support. You could have just written the check, Dad. Why make it ugly?" I stood tall. "Because respect isn't something you buy," I said firmly. "You wanted me to stay away, to erase myself from one of the biggest days of your life. But you had no problem asking me to bankroll it. Do you hear how cruel that sounds?" His wife sneered, stepping closer. "You're old, bitter, and pathetic. You should feel lucky we even bothered asking." The venom in her tone stung, but I refused to let her see it break me. For a moment, my son's eyes softened. Doubt flickered across his face, but it was quickly swallowed by her grip on his arm, dragging him back into her fury. He threw the envelope down on the table and stormed toward the door, muttering under his breath. As the door slammed shut, silence returned to the house. But inside me, something had shifted. I was no longer the father begging for their acceptance. I was a man standing firm in his worth. Asterisk, the week leading up to the wedding was strangely quiet. No phone calls, no messages, no unexpected knocks on my door. For a while, I thought perhaps they had come to their senses, that maybe my son had taken time to reflect on what I said. But that hope evaporated the moment I overheard whispers in town. People spoke of the wedding, of its grandeur, and how the father of the groom had been cut out after refusing to pay. It didn't take long for the story to spread. At the grocery store, neighbors avoided my eyes, pretending to study the shelves whenever I walked past. At the diner, I could feel the weight of hushed voices as I entered, as if my private pain had become public entertainment. My heart ached, but what hurt more was knowing my son was the one allowing this humiliation to fester. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address, just my name written in my son's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it, expecting perhaps an apology or even a plea. Instead, it was a short, cold note. "Do not come to the wedding. You are not welcome. Your presence will only cause problems." Beneath it, in a different scrawl, his wife had added, "Stay out of our lives for good." I sat there in silence, staring at the paper, my chest tight. They didn't just want my money. They wanted my absence, my erasure. But as the days passed, grief slowly hardened into resolve. I knew the truth. This wasn't about me being unworthy. This was about control. And if they thought I would bow out quietly, they underestimated me. I folded the letter, slid it into a drawer, and looked out the window at the setting sun. The wedding might have been theirs, but my dignity was mine, and I wasn't about to let them strip that away. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and bright, but in my house the air was heavy. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring out at the quiet street. My son's big day had arrived, but instead of preparing to walk him down the aisle or offer a proud toast, I was sitting in solitude, nursing the ache of being unwanted. I tried to distract myself with chores, sweeping the floor, watering the plants, folding laundry. Yet everything reminded me of him. The photographs on the wall of his school graduations, the baseball glove tucked in the corner of the closet, even the faint sound of wedding bells drifting in the distance. It all pulled me back to memories of a boy who once needed me for everything. Now he wanted me for nothing. By noon, the town was buzzing. Cars lined the church parking lot. Women in colorful dresses and men in sharp suits filled the sidewalks, their laughter echoing in the air. I stayed away, but it was impossible to ignore the spectacle. From my porch, I could almost imagine the lavish decorations, the music, the speeches. I wondered if they told the guests why I wasn't there. Did they say I had abandoned them? Or perhaps they painted me as selfish, unwilling to support my own child's happiness. The hardest part wasn't missing the ceremony. It was knowing I hadn't even been given a choice. I had been erased from the moment entirely, like my presence was a stain on their perfect picture. But deep down, a part of me whispered that this wasn't the end. The day might belong to them. But the story wasn't finished. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and promised myself something. If my son thought I would fade quietly into the shadows, he was wrong. My absence today was only the beginning of a storm they never saw coming. The photographs from the wedding surfaced quickly. Social media was flooded with perfectly staged smiles, expensive gowns, and a reception hall dripping in gold and silver. Friends tagged me in posts without realizing I hadn't been there, as if twisting the knife just a little deeper. Each picture screamed of wealth, luxury, and excess, yet underneath the glamour, I could see something else. A strain in my son's smile, a tension in his bride's eyes. Behind the polished images, whispers began to reach me. Some guests complained quietly about the extravagance, about the wine that wasn't quite good enough, the food that had run short, or the chaotic seating arrangements. One message from a distant cousin even mentioned how the bride's family had argued over the bill right at the reception. What had been painted as a flawless celebration was already showing signs of cracks. I imagined my son, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than I had made in a month, trying to hold everything together. He had chosen prestige over family, a public performance over private truth. And now, that decision was beginning to backfire. The very people he had wanted to impress were starting to murmur behind his back. That night, as I sat alone scrolling through the endless feed of smiling faces, I realized something profound. They had cut me out, but they couldn't cut out the truth. No amount of champagne, chandeliers, or hollow speeches could cover the unease that lingered beneath the surface of their so-called perfect day. And deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. The cracks in their marriage had appeared before. The ink on their wedding papers had even dried. And when the storm finally broke, I would not be the one picking up the pieces. It didn't take long for the shine of their extravagant wedding to fade. Within weeks, I began hearing hushed conversations from neighbors and relatives. My son and his new wife had returned from their luxurious honeymoon, but instead of basking in marital bliss, they were drowning in bills. The $90,000 invoice they had so confidently tried to push onto me was now looming over their heads like a storm cloud. Creditors started calling. Friends who had lent them money for last-minute expenses were demanding repayment. The bride's family, who had promised to cover certain costs, suddenly pulled back, claiming they had already done enough. Slowly, the picture became clear. Their grand show of wealth had been nothing but smoke and mirrors, and now the debt was suffocating them. I overheard one conversation where my son's wife snapped, "We can't keep living like this. Your father should have helped, but he chose to embarrass us instead." Her voice cracked, and for a moment, I wondered if she truly believed her own words, or if it was simply easier to place the blame on me than to confront their own mistakes. My son didn't argue back. His silence was louder than any defense. Meanwhile, the world they had tried so desperately to build began to unravel. The credit cards were maxed out, the rent overdue, and the pressure was eating away at their smiles. What had once been staged perfection was now a daily struggle to keep up appearances. The glamorous photos that once flooded social media became scarce, replaced with silence. I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a bittersweet recognition of the truth. They had chosen pride over humility, greed over gratitude, and now the storm they had created was finally tearing through the life they had tried so hard to showcase. Asterisk. The day of reckoning finally arrived when my son showed up at my door, unannounced. His shoulders slumped, his face pale, and his eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. I invited him in, though I could feel the tension thick in the air. He sat at my table, staring at his hands as though the words he needed were buried in the lines of his palms. "Dad," he started, his voice hoarse, "we're in trouble." I remained quiet, allowing him the space to admit what he already knew. He explained the mounting debts, the relentless calls, the strain on his marriage. Every word he spoke was a mixture of regret and anger, not at me, but at himself, though he couldn't bring himself to say it outright. Finally, the truth spilled out. "We thought we could handle it, but we can't. And I'm scared, Dad. I don't know how to fix this." His voice cracked, and for a moment, he looked like the little boy who once ran to me after scraping his knee, seeking comfort. The arrogance and entitlement were gone, replaced with vulnerability. I leaned back in my chair, taking a deep breath. "Son, it's not money you need right now. It's humility. You can't keep living beyond your means and expecting others to clean up the mess. If you want help, it has to start with responsibility." My words weren't harsh, but they were firm. He nodded slowly, shame flooding his expression. For the first time in years, there was no defiance in his eyes. Just a young man who had finally hit rock bottom, realizing the foundations of pride and vanity could never support a real life. Asterisk. As my son sat across from me, his head bowed in shame, I realized this moment was the true turning point. All the money in the world couldn't buy the lesson he had just learned. He finally understood that respect, love, and family are worth more than any grand wedding or exotic honeymoon. His pride had crumbled, and in its place stood a man ready to rebuild. Reached across the table, placing my hand on his. "I won't give you money to erase your mistakes," I said softly, "but I will give you guidance, and I will stand by you if you're willing to change." His eyes filled with tears, not of anger or frustration, but of relief. For the first time, he truly heard me not as a stubborn father standing in his way, but as someone who loved him enough to let him fall, so he could rise stronger. In the weeks that followed, he began taking responsibility for his finances, cutting unnecessary expenses, and even picking up extra work. His wife, who once looked at me with disdain, started to treat me with a cautious respect. Slowly, the walls between us began to crack, and though trust was not yet fully rebuilt, the foundation for something better had been laid. Looking back, I realized that being banned from his wedding was not the tragedy I once thought it was. It was the beginning of his awakening. Sometimes love means saying no, even when it breaks your heart. And as I watched my son slowly transform into a man who valued integrity over appearances, I knew the pain had been worth it. In the end, I didn't just save him from debt. I helped him find himself.